back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. Today we're taking a look at the most recent release from the 8th Doctor Adventures saga. There is, of course, the Time War Series 2, or Volume 2, whatever you want to call it, of course, starring Paul McGann as the 8th Doctor and Ratli Thakra as Bliss. Now, previously in this review series, I did review the Time War Volume 1. It came out back in October last year. I needed to check that because due to having Ravenous going on at the same time, I got a little bit confused, which can be a little bit of an issue when it comes to this series because it is essentially a whole year between each box set, so you do tend to need to go back and actually refresh your mind of what happened in the previous adventures. But yeah, I do recommend checking out the previous review of that box set if you want to find out my thoughts and feelings about this line so far. It was a pretty successful box set last time from what I can recall, and also in this review I will go into a few bits of knowledge that are relating to Doom Coalition and Ravenous, because we of course have a character in this series that does return, so yeah, I do recommend checking out those reviews as well if you want to get a little bit of context to the 11 and what my opinions of that character are so far, because the 11 is back, but this time it's not the 11, it's the 12, which she's now female, which I guess is interesting. First off, and as always, in the description below, I will be leaving the link to go and buy this release from the Big Finish website. It's currently out now. The physical release itself is, of course, the 4-pack as per usual, much like Dark Eyes and Doom Coalition, and it is £23. And if you want to just get the download version, that is £20 as well. However, if you actually buy this beyond, I do believe, the end of August, it will be going up to the normal recommended retail when it's available in other retailers such as Amazon and Forbidden Planet stores. It's around £35 for the physical CD and £30 for the downloads. If you're interested by this release, I recommend buying it before it goes up in price to save a few pennies. And as per usual, if you are interested by what I say in this review, then I definitely recommend checking out details on the Big Finish website, along with listening to the actual trailer and taking a look at the casting details. And also, no doubt there will be a few links to other additional reviews on that as well, so you can get other people's thoughts and feelings about the release. Taking a look at some of the details on the Big Finish website now, as I was saying, this is once again another release that in fact has 4 stories, but due to it being in the Time War, it is in fact pretty much all one story, and these episodes are just kind of different chapters in the whole Time War sort of event that we've got going on at the minute. So the first episode, the opening one, is The Lords of Terror, written by Jonathan Morris. Episode 2 is Planet of the Ogorons, written by Guy Adams. Episode 3 is In the Garden of Death, also written by Guy Adams. And then the series finale is Jonah, written by Timothy X. A. Tack, which I think his name is in fact pretty sci-fi when it comes to it. I could imagine his name being on a massive science fiction poster. Is very much sort of suited for this type of franchise. I do know that he originally wrote an early adventures story, I think with the 2nd Doctor last year. Apparently it went down very well, so I'm really intrigued to see how he does in this release, especially with it being within the Time War. And yeah, this is kind of my first outing when it comes to his writing, so yeah, I was very intrigued for this release to see what was going on with him. And then of course this whole box set is in fact directed by Ken Bentley as well. I do believe that is the normal thing as per usual, because I think the previous box set was also directed by him. So going into some of the casting and details now, starting off with Paul McGann as the 8th Doctor, and I think as per usual it is similar compliments. Paul McGann's voice is just so intriguing on audio. Honestly, he's very captivating. Every single scene that he is in has a certain presence behind it, and he's very good for the audio. I think that he's very much suited to that format, and as per usual, it's just so lovely to see this Doctor that in fact had a very small era on the actual TV show itself, able to really spread his wings and have his own adventures for himself. So yeah, similar compliments as per usual, and it's nice to see that Paul McGann's Doctor is in fact slightly altering when it comes to the Time War. I feel that especially throughout this box set, there is a few moments where I almost imagined him coming to be the War Doctor to some extent. He has a few warlike characteristics in there, and he becomes a little bit like a soldier. And oddly, I've always actually seen Paul McGann's Doctor, this sort of very Edwardian romantic character that is very much the English gentleman. I've always imagined him becoming sort of the War Doctor and not the John Hurt Doctor becoming the War Doctor. For some reason, I could just see Paul McGann's Doctor becoming very violent when he gets sort of pushed over the edge, and I like to see that that is almost happening in this box set to some extent. Then we have Ratli Thakra, of course, who plays Bliss. She debuted in the previous box set. Of course, she's the brand new 8th Doctor's companion. And yet, she's interesting. I do believe that she debuted in the episode of Starship Theseus, which was a very timey-wimey one in the opening release for last year. And yeah, I'm still undecided about her character. However, in this release, I do feel that they definitely utilise her kind of knowledge. She does have a little bit of... she's educated and does have a career in kind of technology. And in this episode, well, in this whole series, in fact, fact, there is several moments where she goes and does a few things that maybe a companion isn't expected to do, such as actually take control of a whole submarine pretty much and do things for the Doctor to sort of help him along the way. And especially in the Garden of Death, when they don't really know who they are, I'll come on to that in a little bit. I feel that her and the Doctor actually have this really nice relationship and do bond over sort of not knowing who they are. Realised in this box set, considering we are in the Time War, the only way for Raki to, in fact, or the only way for Bliss to leave this series is probably through death. So I'm really intrigued to see how Big Finish are going to end off her character in sort of a non-dark way. I'm sort of looking forward to see how they end her life when it comes to Big Finish, because I feel like I want it to happen in Time War 3, so then the 8th Doctor can go completely off the rails in Time War 4 and be by himself and kind of be a little bit sort of more darker, and then he sort of leads to Night of the Doctor. That'll be quite intriguing. I think once again something that both Paul McGann could do, and I think that Raki could also perform a really nice exit for that character as well. And I'm the opening story, which I'll come into the script for that in a little bit, but there is basically this moment where they go back to her Earth colony, which gives a little bit more background to her character, which is very much needed by this point because we've not really had it in the previous seasons yet. Additional mentions now, we of course have Nicholas Briggs as every single Dalek. It does in fact have a few experimental Daleks throughout the series. We have one in the series finale that is a very unusual Dalek. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It's a very unusual sounding sort of... He's a little bit calmer to some extent. He kind of sits there. He's a little bit like a politician Dalek, and he's very deep voiced, and he just has a lot of patience for a Dalek, I think. He just is very unusual. So yeah, I like the way that Nicholas did in fact perform that Dalek. And also in episode 2, we're in fact introduced to a Dalek that is incredibly insane, which I like it when Big Finish do these stories. We had a similar one in the War Doctor series where they had these Daleks that were a fraction of Dalek that basically experiment on other Daleks and break the law of what it is to be Dalek, essentially, affect that purity. And this Dalek is anything but pure. He's basically changed his body in order to become this powerful Dalek. Basically, if there's a race that has skills in, say, I don't know, mathematics, he will sort of adapt those skills and bring it onto his own body so that Dalek becomes naturally very good at maths or something like that, or science, or time travel. He has a bit of Time Lord in there. He's basically this patchwork Dalek, and all the other Daleks absolutely hate him. They see him as this abomination, but he is essentially at the same time this Professor Dalek that can do these wacky and wild experiments that do get these results. So at the same time, the Daleks are kind of working with this Dalek that they absolutely hate, but they just put up with him because he's kind of a pretty decent experimental Dalek. So yeah, he's very intriguing, and once again a little bit unsettling considering the context of him being rather sort of human in a way. Finally, as well, for other casting credit mentions, because other people are generally just the minor roles, we of course have Julia Mackenzie as the 12, and I'm going to need to get used to referring to her as the 12 and not the 11. Of course, as I said earlier on in this review, if you want to know my thoughts about the 11 and sort of Mark Bonnard as the 11, check out the Doom Coalition and Ravenous reviews. I do really like the character. Interesting to see the first female incarnation, and I love the way that Julia Mackenzie is basically this person that can play a feeble old woman, and it's perfect for this role because the Time Lords give her character a sort of ring or something that can take control of her previous incarnations, meaning that we definitely get used in the early half of the story that she is introduced to this character that is sort of controlling her previous incarnations, and you get the impression that she wants to change and she's working for the Time Lords, and she is essentially this nice character, meaning that the 8th Doctor and her have a relationship that the 8th Doctor definitely wouldn't have had with the 11. It's definitely more of a friendship rather than a sort of Doctor and enemy relationship, which is rather interesting. But of course, by the very end of the series, and something I'm happy to see, is we had the moment where Julia, in fact, completely breaks out into the 12, and we have her going into her different incarnations. We have a few moments with the 6 in there, the incredibly violent 6, and then we have the 11 coming back as well. And I just love the way that she can, in fact, change from the different personas. She does a very good job. I couldn't imagine it to start with, but she is a very sort of manic, Time Lord, and I do love it. I'm really excited to see where they go with her in the other stories. And I'm now briefly going over each story. As I was saying earlier, the main Time War premise is the thing that kind of puts all these stories together, and if anything, these are kind of just chapters in the Time War, and they're sort of minor events in the Time War. I think that a lot of people will be put off these box sets because they like the Time War being mysterious. It was something very much that put people off the War Doctor series, and of course, we've gone from now in a number of years of not knowing what the Time War was, it being this very mysterious and powerful event, and we don't really have many glimpses into it, to literally having so many different takes of the Time War in Big Finish. Of course, we have 12 episodes of the War Doctor in the Big Finish box sets that were released a few years back, and then we of course have Gallifrey Time War, we have the War Master, Only the Good, and no doubt we'll have a few more in the future as well, along with the 8th Doctor Time War prequel series that is now happening. So yeah, we do have a lot of different encounters with the Time War, and what I like is Big Finish aren't doing the big events. We've not had, from what I can recall, any mention to the Nightmare Child. We've not had anything to the Gates of Elysium yet. If anything, these are just minor new events, and I like the way that we're getting a bit of a involvement within the Time War, but at the same time, I understand the people who don't really want to know about it, because it should be this mysterious part of time, a mysterious era in Doctor Who, and it is quite hard to make the Time War not be like any other war, because you can very easily do a story that is just guns, explosions, and everything, much like how the Day of the Doctor was when it gave a glimpse into the Time War. However, the thing with the Time War is it is a war on time, as it says in the title. So there is a few timey-wimey episodes in the previous series, and it is nice to see that that is also used in this series as well. However, I still want to see more of that. It was something that was definitely lacking in the War Doctor series, but I like the way that Big Finish are now sort of really getting to grips with the Time War theme. The first episode is The Lords of Terror, written by Jonathan Morris, and it is a rather interesting one. Of course, we go to Bliss's colony planet, and we find out that basically her world has been completely ripped apart by the Time War, and what she knew from her world has been completely destroyed. The likelihood of her parents being killed is incredibly high. Everybody that she knows is now dead, and everywhere that she sort of knew as a child is now sort of blown into destruction, basically. So yeah, it's nice to see that we have a more personal perspective of the Time War and how it's affected somebody's planet. But what I like about this episode is essentially her parents never even existed. She is, I do believe, what they refer to as a refugee of the Time War, where they exist, but they shouldn't really exist because their family have been destroyed. And yeah, it is rather unusual. I like the way that we have, like, Jonathan Morris going into that and how it affects different people personally. But the interesting thing about this story is we are so used to the Daleks being the main enemy, but this episode does something where you think you're going into another substandard Time War. Daleks are the enemy, Time Lords are the good ones, and they need to stop the Daleks invading this colony planet. You do think it is the same old Time War story. However, by the very end of this episode, you find out that the Daleks aren't the enemy. The Daleks aren't even involved really in the situation. They have a few moments here and there. However, it turns out that the Time Lords are in fact the main issue, because the Time Lords and the Daleks are pretty much just as bad as each other. And the Time Lords have took control of this colony, and they've got the last remaining survivors together, and have basically said this massive Dalek fleet is coming, and you need to prepare weapons and missiles in order to protect yourself. But it turns out that the Dalek fleet isn't coming whatsoever. They aren't even interested in the planet at all. And the Time Lords are just basically using this last remaining people from this species as essentially a weapons factory to create missiles for the Time Lords to use against the Daleks in the Time War. When the Doctor, in fact, realises what is going on, he's a little bit lost of what to do, because he realises that the Time Lords are essentially just as bad as the Daleks. And I like it because it's nice to have an episode that, in fact, changes the perspective and says, no, the Time Lords are actually sort of just as mean and just as bad. And by this point, if any of them are to actually win, to be honest, the outcome probably not be that different. And the Doctor, I think, feels a little bit disposable and useless in this story, which is kind of what I like. It would have maybe been nice to go into this episode with a little bit more propaganda, because I feel like this story is very much based around propaganda and morale and kind of boosting morale. It's a little bit like a war effort story, maybe similar to the conscript that we had in Volume 1 last year. I did feel that this is probably one of the weaker entries for this release, because it just felt a little bit slower when compared to the others. Moving on to episode 2, we have Planet of the Ogorons, written by by Guy Adams. Now, I was rather intrigued to see the Ogrons back, because I can't really recall much of the Ogrons in classic series Doctor Who. I know they were in the Day of the Daleks, and I think the Frontier in Space as well, but I've never really got used to their character. They're nothing really that have actually interested me that much. However, this episode really nicely gets the Ogron species and basically says that they're this really simple-minded race, and the Dalek that I was mentioning earlier, the scientist Dalek that sort of adapted himself, has seen that the Ogrons are very easy to change and is using them as this experimental creature. And in the story, we are introduced to an Ogron who is basically, or thinks that he is the Doctor, and we have this opening scene at the very start of the story that has an Ogron coming out of the TARDIS on Gallifrey, and he says, "I'm the Doctor," and offers the Chancellery Guard a Satsuma. And it's one of those episodes where you just get this wacky and wild opening, and then the rest of the episode is kind of explaining how it gets to that point. And I think that Guy Adams does a really good job of revealing certain parts of the plot at certain points in the episode. The moment where he says, "We'll go to the planet of the Ogrons," the definite article, you might say. And because the Ogron is such a simplistic creature, you do kind of feel sorry for it, but at the same time, it is used as a comedic effect. But I think that in this point in the Time War, it's nice to have that light-hearted element in there, because even though it's quite light-hearted, it's still got this very dark premise behind it as well, of adapting this alien race, simply almost for fun, but also at the same time to gain weapons for the Time War. This episode, we are also introduced to Julia Mackenzie as the 12, and we have this really intriguing opening where we think that she's being good, and we have this wonderful moment in almost a cafe where she's pouring tea for the Doctor and Bliss. She is just this feeble old woman, and Bliss says, "Doctor, why are you scared?" She's just this vulnerable old woman, but really you think deep down, you know exactly why the Doctor is scared, because that feeble old woman used to be Mark Bonar's 11, this evil sort of renegade Time Lord that is essentially mad, insane, and yet it is very unusual, and you do get the impression that Paul McGann has had previous encounters with Julia Mackenzie. So I'm expecting her to maybe pop up in the sort of last box set of Ravenous. Maybe Mark Bonar will regenerate into her. That would be very cool to see, because this Doctor has definitely had previous encounters with her. Yeah, she's very good throughout the story, and I really like this one. This is probably maybe my favourite episode for this series, but also at the same time, I feel like the other episode that I really like, I like for different reasons. So kind of both of them have different reasons for me to like them. And the other episode that I really like is Jonah, the series finale. And yeah, I'll get onto that in a little bit. It's just a very unusual one. This episode is In the Garden of Death, which is a continuation of Planet of the Ogrons, written by Guy Adams once again. And this episode is a rather unusual story, as we have the Doctor, Bliss, and the 12, and they don't in fact know who they are. The knowledge has been completely took from them and been put on this prison planet that is essentially this big massive garden with lots of plants absolutely everywhere. And every so often, on occasions, we get a glimpse to these interrogations of the Doctor and Bliss and the 12 actually finding out who they are, and they are getting interrogated by the Daleks. And it is an intriguing story because, of course, the viewer is somebody who has more knowledge than the actual characters within the episode, so you put up with the fact that the Doctor doesn't know who he is. It's nice to have a little bit of a break from the story of, "Oh, I'm the Doctor, I'm in this Time War, and I don't want to fight," but instead, he doesn't know who he is, he doesn't know his identity, he could be a bad guy who is being interrogated for good reasons, and it's the fact that the Daleks are good and they are interrogating this horrible person, and they're trying to get information out of him. He could be a criminal. The same with the 12 as well. However, she kind of breaks from this illusion because of her personas. She doesn't have the ring anymore. It's her different incarnations, meaning that they come out of her eventually, and she sort of cracks in this story, but she cracks more, so to speak, in Jonah, which, as I say, I'll get onto that in a little bit. But I think that this story is really intriguing and definitely gives the characters sort of development without them knowing who they are, which is really odd but interesting at the same time. This does have a similar case to the Lords of Terror, where I feel that this story just needed something a little bit different in there, or something just to make it a bit more entertaining and exciting. I think that we do have glimpses throughout the interrogation to the different people and the Daleks using different ways to interrogate, and we later find out that when they interrogate the 12 in this story, or in the events of this story, we find out that the 12 accidentally sort of lets on more than she should have, and that leads to the whole of the plot for the 4th episode of this box set. And I think it would have been nice to maybe have a bit more interrogation in there, just to make it a bit more exciting, maybe a bit more deadly as well, because a similar thing to the opening story, is where, when you're comparing it to the other episodes in this release, it does fall a little bit below standard. So I do definitely think that Planet of the Ogorons and Jonah are the main two that I like in this box set. However, these two, sort of the Lords of Terror and In the Garden of Death, are just a little bit below, but I still find them interesting. They are a little bit more relaxing, sort of, and they have a little bit less going on. It's nice to go into a different area of the Time War that kind of isn't on a battlefront. Series finale is Jonah, written by Timothy X. Attack. Now, this episode is essentially, there's no denying it, a base under siege. And the interesting thing about this one is Cardinal Lystra, played by Jacqueline Pierce, of course somebody that we've got used to in the Doom Coalition series, as well as the War Doctor series as well. She later has a very strong relationship with the War Doctor. It's kind of a love-hate relationship to some extent. This episode, Cardinal Lystra plonks the Doctor into this submarine on a different planet in this sea in order to gain this knowledge of what's going on, because there is this all-powerful source of energy that is underneath this seabed on this random planet, because this sea is unusual and it stops the use of energy weapons. So we basically have a Dalek submarine and a Time Lord submarine, along with another Time Lord submarine sort of watching what's going on, and they basically have a little bit of a fight-off without using weapons. So we see how the Daleks can in fact become really deadly by essentially using themselves as projectiles, because of course missiles can't work in this water because it's special water, because the powerful source has kind of made it so nothing like time travel can actually occur. And it is a very unusual idea, and you do very much live in sort of the darkness in this story of trying to find out what this all-powerful being is. And yeah, we see the Daleks in fact using themselves and throwing Daleks out of their submarine in order to hit the Time Lord submarine, in order just to create dents and damage, in order to sort of hopefully create a puncture that will eventually kill them all. And the interesting thing about this story is it is very confined. We do have a submarine, and that is all we get used to in this episode. The Doctor becomes the captain of a submarine, and he is called Jonah throughout this episode, which is a rather odd characteristic. It's nice to see him resuming the role of a captain, and it's interesting to see that Cardinal Lystra has kind of plonked him into the front line of the Time War, kind of, without him even thinking it. So yeah, I think it is an unusual perspective, and the Doctor does almost get a little bit like a soldier in the release, almost a captain that is in charge of these soldiers, and we have him fighting off against the Daleks in order to not find out what this odd, usual power source is. In the story, the 12 properly cracking up, which is at the final act of this box set, where we find out that the interrogation in the Garden of Death in the previous episode in fact went a little bit further than we first thought, and something occurs and the Daleks get this knowledge that they didn't have beforehand, and the 12 almost becomes a little bit of a Dalek slave, or somebody that is being rewritten by the Daleks, and around these submarines saying seek, locate, destroy, and just going a little bit mad. There is this great moment where they need to turn off all of the power sources in the submarine, and it works so well on audio because the sound design is so mute and you know nothing is going on. You really feel like you're underwater with the crew in the submarine, and they turn all the power off, and you think all is well and the Dalek submarine is going up above so they can't detect them. And then all of a sudden from the other side of the submarine you just hear this cackle and the 12 singing, and it's echoing down the submarine, and you can just know the Daleks will be able to hear that up above, and you feel like they're all doomed by that point pretty much. And it just sounds so evil, and she has some excellent moments, and I honestly think that the 12 is going to crack a little bit more, and the prediction is for the next box set that the 12 is going to kill Bliss. And I really hope so, because that will be so evil, but I can't wait for that to happen. And I'm wondering what the 13th incarnation will be like, because I'm guessing, due to it being a combination of all the incarnations, I think that with the 13th being the final one, it might be sort of the 12 will become this weird entity of everything, sort of everything that it's been in all of its lives, so it'll utilise all the different skills of the different versions of that character into one incarnation, kind of the best bits added into one piece, which will be very unusual to see. Unusual power source thing in this release that the Daleks are trying to track down in order to sort of harbour its technology is something called the Urashima, which, from what I'm assuming, or from what I picture, is basically this giant, all-powerful squid creature, and it speaks sort of in rhymes and odd Shakespearean-like language, and it is a little bit complex. I think that this episode is one of which that I in fact needed to go back to the start of to understand again after listening to it, because I did feel a little bit confused. So I do recommend this one for maybe the more experienced Big Finish listener, because it is a little bit more experimental. The same with the opening story as well, the way that we have the Daleks not being the main enemy. I kind of feel like this box set is more sort of an experimental one, even though, as I said, the series finale is essentially a base under siege. It's a base under siege with a difference, because you feel like it's a different story because of what it actually contributes, with Hiroshima being in there, which I'll let you find out a little bit more about that if you're going to buy this release. And yeah, it just feels a little bit more unique, so I definitely give this box set credit for doing something new, because I feel not one of these episodes, maybe with an exception of the first one, are samey. I feel like other episodes, such as in the War Doctor era, could be classed as a little bit samey, but this one at least does stuff different, so I like that. Overall, for this box set, I could just sum it up as wacky and wild because of the Planet of the Orgaron story. It is just such a nice novelty. I partly want that story to be renamed The Day of Dr. Orgaron, because I want more Dr. Orgaron. He's just excellent, and a really nice light-hearted twist for the Time War, and I think that this is a fun one to listen to, especially with Julia Mackenzie being there. Much like the previous Time War box set, you could probably use this one as a jumping on point. I don't really think you need to have much prior knowledge to the previous box set to listen to this one. From what I can recall, there isn't really much in there, because it's just, you're in the Time War, things are going down, and there's a few timey-wimey twists in there as well. So yeah, if you are looking for something new, I do recommend this box set, but if you're somebody that likes consistency, maybe start off with Time War 1, then move on to Time War 2, before going on to any of the others, because that kind of makes a little bit more sense. But yeah, if you like Ravenous and Doom Coalition as well, you may like this box set. I do definitely think it pushes it a bit more out there compared to Time War Series 1, because that was a good cinematic box set, but I think it was a little bit too much just like any old war. Conscription story was very much a hark back to the World Wars on Earth, of course, which I feel like it shouldn't be like that, because the Time War is something that is this completely different entity in its own right, and it needs to actually be presented like that as well. So yeah, this box set definitely attempts to do that. I'm hoping that that develops further in the next releases in Time War 3 and Time War 4. But yeah, overall, a rather nice, powerful box set, one of which that I do recommend. However, it would be nice to see a few more tweaks to In Garden of Death and also the Lords of Terror as well, just to make them a little bit more entertaining and exciting, to sort of live up to Jonah and the Dr. Orgaron story. Thanks for watching this review. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions about this release, then please do leave them in the description below, along with if you have any questions about the 8th Doctor era on Big Finish as a whole. I will try my best to answer them. I've not listened to the early half of the 8th Doctor era in like the EDAs with Pollard or even Lucy Miller. I've not really listened to many of those, so yeah, I will try and help out as best as possible. But if you see any questions in the comment section below that you in fact know the answer to, help each other out, because I'm not the best or knowledgeable person when it comes to the 8th Doctor era. If anything, I've just got used to the more recent stuff as opposed to the earlier stuff. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this review. I guess I'll see you all in more Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama reviews in the future, along with many more Doctor Who product reviews coming in the near future as well. So thanks for watching, and I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.